Chapter 15. Sink or Swim. I started wrestling again on August 10th, which was way too soon. The plan was for me to do tag matches for a while, mostly standing on the apron. In the dressing room at the pavilion before my first match back, my dad introduced me to George Scott, one of the famous Scott brothers who'd worked for him back in the 1960s. George, who, it later struck me, bears a striking resemblance to Donald Rumsfeld, was lured out of a long and prosperous run as NWA booker for the Crockett's to become the WWF's booker and one of Vince McMahon's top soldiers. He'd come to Calgary to make Stu an offer he couldn't refuse. Vince wanted Stu's territory. If Stu didn't sell, McMahon would work his way into the territory anyway, and we'd be out of business and broke too. At least there was an offer of a buyout. George was standing beside Stu as my dad explained the WWF's proposition to me. Stampede Wrestling would shut down, the WWF's TV show would replace Stu's show, and my parents would get US $250,000 up front and 10% of all house shows subsequently run in any of Stu's regular towns, including Vancouver. My reaction was instant relief, although I didn't reveal the extent of it to George. My parents had lost a fortune, and it seemed to me that selling the whole headache to McMahon would guarantee them a comfortable and well-deserved retirement. Of course, I had practical concerns about my own future. Stu went on to explain that the WWF had offered to move Bruce into an office job as their representative promoting all the towns in Western Canada. Vince would also hire Dynamite, Davey, me and maybe eventually Big Jim, who was still working Louisiana, as full-time wrestlers. I was immediately envious of what they had in mind for Bruce because he'd be home every night. I told George that I didn't have any aspirations to languish at the bottom of their cards. He smiled and shook his head. "You don't get it. You're going to work with all the top guys in all the top angles. We're going to make you a big star, Bret." I thought, yeah, right. In a few days, he said, Dynamite and I would fly down to WWF television tapings so McMahon could take a look at us. I leveled with George, telling him that I could barely walk across the room. It wasn't exactly a good time to show off my skills. He told me the match would be short and I wouldn't have to do much. I didn't want to lose out on the opportunity, so I agreed. My dad asked me to keep everything under my hat for the time being. I met up with some of the boys after the show. When I got home at about 3 a.m., I was startled to find Wilk asleep on my bed. He explained that Julie was at the hospital and had called him to come babysit Jade until I got home. By late the next afternoon, Julie was still in labor, and I called Stu to try to get out of working in Edmonton that night. He calmly said, "You'll need the extra money." That's how I found myself being told the news that Julie and I now had a son on a grimy gas station pay phone in Red Deer, Dallas. Jeffrey Hart was born on August 11, 1984. About a week later, Tom and I flew east and spent all day backstage at the Hamilton Civic Center watching WWF wrestlers go about their routine at a TV taping. We'd been required to be at the building by 11 a.m. and found out that TV tapings were an all-day affair. We weren't allowed to leave until after the matches were over, just before midnight. The WWF provided no food, there were no nearby restaurants, and we got hungry. Wrestlers wandered by: Superfly Jimmy Snuka, Roddy Piper, Greg Valentine, Adrian Adonis, Tito Santana. Large soundproof panels served to partition off an area where the wrestlers took turns churning out their TV promos, doing the same 60-second spot for dozens of different markets, just changing the name of the local arena or town. Although I'd gotten better on the mic, I cringed when I heard how precise and intense the WWF wrestlers were with their promos. The New York territory was infamous for its walk and talk, and these were some of the best mic men in the business. I knew I was in trouble. This would be sink or swim. Jay Strongbow, better known as Chief, approached us with his hands behind his back and his lower lip jutting out, to set up our TV tag match. Chief was a heavyset Italian, now in his mid-50s, who had got away with wrestling as an American Indian for years. These days Chief was an agent, a foreman, who carried out the boss's orders. I was relieved when he told me to lose the Buddy the Heartthrob gimmick. We'd be going with Bret Hart. From the way Chief sized Tom up, it was clear that his reputation had preceded him. He told Tom to take the fall however he wanted, alerting us to make sure the tag match, including intros, was less than 4 minutes long. Vince McMahon, whom Chief referred to as the Emperor, waved Tom and me over. Vince was 6'2", combed his hair straight back, and was wearing white running shoes and a red suit jacket with padded shoulders. To me, the Emperor looked more like Big Boy from the hamburger chain. Giant men, ripped and cut, tanned and oiled, passed by vying for his attention. I had no choice but to accept the undeniable truth that he had the power to change my life forever, for better or worse. Tom, never much of a conversationalist, replied with a grunt when Vince complimented him on his muscled look. Then, glancing at me, Vince said dryly, "I like my wrestlers to spend a lot of time in the gym. I'm looking forward to your match." I hoped he understood that I had just come off knee surgery. Then Chief called him away. My first WWF match turned out to be a disaster. I wasn't accustomed to guzzling a jobber, working such a short match. I'd been off for so long that I was rusty, and as I slammed the jobber, my knee gave out. Tom, who was perched on the top corner, groaned because I slammed him facing the wrong way. I had to go back and pull the jobber around by his legs. Tom rolled his eyes and frowned at me just before he launched into a perfect dive. I was horrible. And I knew it. Vince met us when we came back. He didn't even look at me as he said, "Nice work, Dynamite." The WWF tapings lasted 2 days, during which they got 3 weekends of TV in the can. In Poughkeepsie, New York, Hulk Hogan and David Schultz greeted Tom and me with big smiles. They appeared to be the best of pals, kidding each other and play wrestling. Tom and I sat watching as their friendly tussle escalated into a full-blown scrap, with Schultz cinched up in a front face lock. For 45 minutes at least, they overturned furniture and got nasty rug burns on their knees and elbows, until Hogan won when a seething Schultz gave up. And that was the moment their friendship ended. I was in another 4-minute match, this time singles, and I had a much better outing, doing a perfect pile driver. But when I came through the curtain, Chief met me with a perturbed look and said, "That's Orndorff's finish. Don't use it again." At the end of the night, Tom and I each got paid $50. The day before we got CDN $75. Even the biggest stars were only paid this token sum for TV, since the WWF felt the wrestlers should be grateful for the exposure. Dynamite grumbled to me that he didn't fly all that way to get paid $50. He told Stu to tell the WWF to go fuck themselves. He didn't need it, he and Davey had Japan. On the Sunday night of the August long weekend, I bent over the crib, gazing at Dallas. He had big beautiful eyes, not one hair on his head, and his mom's mouth. Things were no better between Julie and me. My right knee would never survive Japan. I realized that if I wanted to feed my family, I needed to heal and fast. I'd have to take steroids. This was one of the most difficult decisions I ever made. I called Tom, and within minutes he showed up at my house armed with 2 loaded needles, one for each butt cheek. Later on that night I lay shivering in a fever, running to the bathroom with diarrhea and vomiting. It turned out the steroids were from a veterinarian and were meant for horses. Tom got sick too. Davey, who'd been charged for hip-tossing that Calgary cop, was panicking about the possibility that he'd be deported as a result, and rather suddenly announced that he and Dee would be getting married in October. All this time no one had any clue of the huge decision my father was in the process of making, to sell or not to sell. On Friday, September 6th, Stu finally let it slip that he had sold to Vince, and that this would be the final taping of the Stampede Wrestling TV show. Bruce was beyond livid. Stu and Helen had kept him out of the loop. His grief and fear came out as fury, and he refused to work. He even tried to rally the boys to boycott the show. It's been said that Stu sold Stampede Wrestling because he felt he owed it to my mom to get out of the business with a retirement nest egg, but what he told me, more than once over the years, is that the biggest reason he sold was because he just couldn't tolerate the way Bruce ran things. After the last TV taping, we went on the road for a week, winding up at the Edmonton Field House on September 15, 1984, for a final cage match. Most of the boys spent the week drowning their fears of uncertain futures in beer. There I was, climbing the steel mesh of the cage with a ghastly long gash in my forehead. I was mad, glad, and sad that it was all over. I was teamed, with an equally inebriated Dynamite, against Rotten Ron Starr and Bad News. Everyone bled except News. Rotten Ron, with his red afro and southern drawl, was as creepy a wrestler as there ever was. Fans would spit on him, and he'd catch it in his own mouth, swallow and smile. I happily planted a boot into Rotten Ron's face. Dynamite had fought free from Bad News, and together we made our escape up the sides of the cage, climbing over the top, barely out of the clawing grasp of the heels. We could see the faces of fans, who had seen us through so much. Halfway down the outside of the cage, we dropped to the floor to an explosion of joy drenched in sadness. I wobbled back to the dressing room, numb. I said my final goodbyes to Carl Moffat, the Japs, and, in particular, the Cuban. So many of Stu's crew were good hands, but with Vince McMahon in the ascendant, it was the dawn of the age of steroid freaks. Although I was under no illusions about my chances of success in the WWF, at least I had a new job. and I was concerned about what would become of them all. Hito. For him it was over, and he knew it. But he smiled like an old cat, and I couldn't help but feel that he still had a few lives left. He'd land on his feet somewhere. Ross. Wayne. Nothing. But aside from Bruce, nobody was angry. How could they be? Stu had been losing a lot of money for a long time but still paying their wages, and they all knew it. When fans who had been with us since 1948, through all the highs and lows of the Calgary territory, tuned in the next week to see the show, it had simply vanished, and Vince's show was on instead. Something uniquely vaudevillian was lost forever. For me, it was a thin line between love and hate. I wouldn't miss the endless white lines, the bad weather, the physical pain and the loneliness, but I'd miss the boys, the fans and the towns. As the band rocked and rolled down the highway back to Calgary, JR and the boys harmonized through one last rendition of Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley. Hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, poor boy, you're bound to die. I was unsure whether it was the beginning of the end, or the end of my beginning.